Hey guys, welcome back to Gotta Be Geek, where we go through tutorials, dev tools, and just talk about other tech related stuff to help you be a better engineer or developer. And in today's video, I wanted to talk about the fact that a few days ago, Typescript had announced their version 3.8 release, so I figured, hey, it'd be a great time to talk about adding Typescript to your project. In some previous videos, I talked about Parcel.js and Webpack tutorials, where we went through setting up Webpack or Parcel.js as your module bundler. And so I figured we'll do a part 1 and a part 2. So in today's part 1, we'll talk about adding TypeScript to a Webpack project, and in a part 2, in a later video, we'll talk about adding TypeScript to your Parcel.js project. Those of you that watched the previous video I did last week, you might have noticed that the intro for this one was the normal short one instead of the extended one that I'd done in the previous video. I had a pretty fun time talking with Jake on that video where we did a collaboration talking about some tech talk stuff. So if you haven't seen that video, highly suggest it. You can click on that up above and let me know what you think. For those of you that watched that intro, say anything you want about it in the comment section below. If it was too long, if you liked it. I spent a pretty good amount of time on it, probably more than I should have, learning some neat transitions and things like that I hadn't really done. One of the tools that I bought to make that video possible was this guy, which was the DJI Ronin SC Pro Kit. Came with a few other little goodies and stuff, but it was my first time ever using a gimbal, and I hadn't really ever thought about doing any kind of reviews on the channel, but it was pretty fun to buy, and I do need to think of other things to use this for other than that one intro video. So if you tell me what you think about the intro in the comment section below. If you'd like me to talk about my time with the gimbal for that video and what it was like, and I can do a video on that, let me know about that. And if you have any suggestions that I can do for any kind of tech or kind of nerdy related videos to reuse this, please let me know, because I'm sure my wife would love it if I found other uses for this than one video. So let me know what you think, and we'll stop delaying it and we'll hop on the computer here and we'll get into adding TypeScript to our projects. All right, so first up, we have our Webpack tutorial project as an example from when we did the Webpack tutorial for beginners video. If you haven't seen that video, check it out. I'll have a link for it up at the top or in the description below as well. And so I pulled that example that I've uploaded to my GitHub repository, which I'll have a link for in the description below. And we're gonna get into it here where we're gonna add TypeScript to our Webpack configuration, and we'll be able to see what it's like running a project with TypeScript. And so the first thing we need to do here is add the necessary packages for our project. So we'll go ahead and go through, I'll add these just like I would in normal videos. I'm gonna go through and add all the packages, kind of fast forward that clip a little bit, and then I'll go over the different packages once I've added them all in here. Okay, so we've got all the packages we need here, and I'll go over these. So the first several that we have here are types packages. These just pull in the types for the various packages that we're using. Not all packages come with their types. Some do, some don't. If your project or the library that you're using doesn't come with types, usually you can do an @type / and then whatever the project name is, and you'll be able to get types for that. And sometimes they're not there either. But more and more packages are either coming with their own types, or they're having someone else usually, will generate their types and upload them to this types extension here. So after that, we have the remaining three. So TS-Loader, TS-Node, and TypeScript. So TS-Loader is what Webpack is going to use to actually process the TypeScript and turn it into JavaScript. TS-Node, this is so that we can have a typed Webpack config. This isn't a required thing, but it's a preference for me. I figure if we're gonna go TypeScript, why not try and go all the way? And I'll go over the different ways that you can create the Webpack config so that you don't need this in the event that you don't wanna use TS-Node package. And then lastly is TypeScript, which is kind of the bread and butter of this, is it gives us our types. So next up, we'll move into the Webpack config here, where we'll go ahead and add in everything that we need for our TypeScript, our Webpack package to process TypeScript. And so I'll add in the different things we need here, and then we'll go over them. All right, so that was pretty quick. Wasn't a lot to add in this, and this is the option if we're not going to use TS-Node. As you can see, we still have Webpack config.js as our JavaScript extension. So we're not adding any types to the Webpack config. You can see we've added here tsloader, which is we're telling basically that it needs to look for TypeScript files now, not just JavaScript files. And when it encounters TypeScript files, we want to pass it to the tsloader to process those files and then output the JavaScript, and then continue processing everything else. So everything else here will remain the same and not a lot of differences. The next step we need though is to define our configuration for TypeScript. And so the way we do that is a tsconfig file. So we'll add that in. And then there's several configuration options that you can do for tsconfig. I'm going to add then the ones that I'm kind of used to adding. There's a plethora of them out there. I'll have a link in the description below for the different TypeScript configurations and what some of them do, but I'll go add in the ones that I use and kind of briefly go over some of them. Okay, so I've added in all the different options here, and I'll go over a few of these. So first, the kind of obvious ones are include and exclude. And so include is just telling the tsconfig where it needs to look for TypeScript files. Exclude is saying, hey, we want to ignore things in this directory. And if I wanted to, I could tell it to ignore outdir here, but it's automatically ignoring it because it's where we're outputting the files to, so we don't have to worry about that. No implicit any. This is just saying that we don't want to have any implicit types that we haven't defined. So we want to, it's basically a way of saying we want everything to have a type defined. And if you don't have a type for it, then just define that it is indeed an any explicitly. And so we'll go over what that looks like in a little bit. Module is just explaining what kind of module file you're writing. As you can see here in the tooltip, there's several different types. CommonJS is common, and therefore it's just an easiest one for, I think, most people to use, but in different situations you can use different ECMAScript formats. I'll have a link probably in the description below so you can check out what some of these different ones do and what their purposes are for. But for the purpose of this, CommonJS just works fine. Target is telling it what we want the output to look like, in this case ES5, which is pretty standard for a lot of browsers, and most browsers are compatible with it. Sometimes if you use certain features in some of the later ECMAScripts, you might have like an old version of maybe Internet Explorer or something that something doesn't work quite right in. So I've just found ES5 is pretty common and works well with most things. Allow JS is just saying whether or not we want to allow JavaScript to be in the TypeScript files. I'm writing TypeScript, so preferably I want to stay away from JavaScript. So for me, I put this to false. But in some cases, you might find this kind of avoidable, especially in the beginning as you're kind of getting used to using TypeScript. So if you're just kind of getting used to it, maybe you set it to true and you just kind of play around with using a mixture of TypeScript and JavaScript, but I don't like really doing that, so I set it to false. And then allow synthetic default imports in ES module interop. These aren't, I guess, necessarily quite required, but they do allow a lot of different features for things I've used in the past, and I've just found that having these enabled allows more features and things to kind of work a bit better. So I generally just put these in here and set them to true. And then source map is just outputting map files to aid in mapping debug information and other things about the files after like transpiling. And so you can set that, you don't need that to true, but it just helps to have that information there, and that covers it. The only thing that you'll see here is that this little icon is highlighted with a little red squiggly line, and that's just saying that it can't find anything, and that's expected right now because we haven't turned anything into TypeScript files yet. So it's just saying, hey, like we don't see any TypeScript files. So once we add in TypeScript files, it will look at them and see them, and this should go away. All right, so the next thing we want to do is go ahead and change our file here, our JavaScript file, to a TypeScript file. So we'll rename the extension here to index.ts. And then you'll see that well, at least for me, the icon has changed. I think it might be because I have a icon package installed, and you can install a bunch of different icon packages for VS Code, but this is the one I have. So if your icons don't change or quite look the same as mine, don't worry, it's not a big deal. It's probably just an icon package. So we've changed the extension here. So now we have a TypeScript file, and we don't have any types defined here, but we can actually realize that we never actually installed the packages that I listed out here. So we'll go through our npm install. And so the difference is, I think in previous videos, you can just do npm install and then the name of the package. I didn't want to have to type out all the different packages in the command bar here. It was a little easier to kind of show them in the list here. So if you add a package in the dependencies here, and you can just install all of those at once by just hitting npm install with nothing else after it. And you can see it's installed all the packages here. So now we should be able to come back to our index.ts here, and now we have no more issues with Lodash because the types were missing because we hadn't installed them before. So now we can go through and we could add various types to our functions here, and we'll be able to show what it looks like when we have a TypeScript file and then what that output ends up looking like. So we can see when we hover over this that it's telling us that we have an HTML div element type. So we can go ahead and add in the HTML div element. And then if we hover over this one, we can see it's saying the same thing. And then we'll do HTML div element. And then that pretty much gives us all of the different types. And so we don't really need to set it here because this is just a property on element, and it already understands that inner string is a string. And so we can't really change the type here. If we go to peek the definition, and we should be able to see that inner HTML, if we can find it. Let's do inner HTML. There we go. So we can see that it has inner HTML, and it's already defined as a string type here. So we don't need to do that again here. So we can save this, and then now we should be able to run our Webpack config. And it looks like I've missed a step here, which is fine. So we'll go into our Webpack config file and figure out what I missed. Okay, so we need to change our entry point here to index.ts because we don't have a JS file anymore, and you can see the error was pretty helpful here. It was just saying it can't find an entry because the index.js file is gone. So now we can come back and try that again. So it looks like we're just full of errors today. So I've apparently missed our TS config here, which makes sense. So we'll fix that. And then there we go. So now we're not red on our TS config anymore. So we should be able to finally get this working. Cool. So now we have our TypeScript processing through the TS loader and outputting it. And we can go to our dist folder here, and we can see that we still have a main.js file, and we have now JavaScript in this file, and it's taken our TypeScript and turned it into JavaScript. So pretty simple. And now we can kind of have, a lot more explicitness around, if that's a word, explicitness. We can be more explicit about the types that we have to make it clear when people are reading our project or our code, and they can see exactly what it is without trying to guess. This makes it a little bit easier when we have functions that are in a different library and we don't see them, or even if it's on the same file, I guess we can have a function here that does something with a string. But if I didn't type it out as the actual type, then it's going to be kind of confusing on what this is actually doing. And so we can say that this is just going to do something and it doesn't return anything, which is why I put the type void here. And it's telling us here that this, which is what I said I'd give an example for earlier, we're implicitly saying this can be anything. So what I could essentially end up doing is in another function, I could call, oh, looks like I spelled that wrong there. And I could just pass in an object that's got this here. And this doesn't complain because we haven't defined what the type is for the do something with a string. And it sees that, well, this can actually be anything, which is why the implicit any is here. And this is why I kind of don't like having implicit any set to false, because then you kind of allow this kind of behavior where you're not really taking advantage of what TypeScript offers you. And so in this case, we want to be more explicit about taking in a string here. And then we get this very clear message that shows, hey, like, we only want a string. We don't want you to pass in an object that has some property that has a string. And so otherwise, because we're going to probably end up running into an error or something. What you can do, though, in some cases, there are some errors, or not errors, some methods, functions that you may have where you may want to do processing on something that could be an object or it could be a string. And so in those cases where you want to explicitly allow that, you can say that this can be a string or an object. And now you can see that we're passing in an object, and that works. And then we can go in here and do something with a string, and we can do that as well. And that will also work. And this is if you know that you're intending to operate on a string or object specifically, and you have some logic in your function that's going to handle those differently and without kind of any error or problem. And that kind of is it. So now we've added TypeScript to our project. We can see it compiles and runs it just fine, and that's it. So the next thing I wanted to do was, earlier I had talked about showing what it would look like to have a typed Webpack config file. And so we'll go ahead and go over to our Webpack config file, and first we're going to rename this to a TypeScript file, and then we'll go through the changes. I'll come in here and I'll make the necessary changes as usual and go over what those are for once I'm done. Okay, so now that I've added all of what I need here, we'll go ahead and go over these changes. And so since we're using a TypeScript file and we are going to have TS node processing this file rather than just running Webpack running the JavaScript file, we can use our imports here that we couldn't use before. So we have import Webpack so that we can get this Webpack and the type for the configuration. And then we change the path and Webpack plugin and clean Webpack plugin, or HTML Webpack plugin and clean Webpack plugin. Those are tongue twisters, and into imports as well. And then we've changed this into a variable that we're now exporting as a default variable down here at the bottom. And I haven't changed any of the configuration itself, but what we have here is, now that we've defined that this is a Webpack configuration type, we can see that there's actually a bunch of different options here, and we can see the different types of those options because we have the types for Webpack installed. Some of these you kind of have before adding TypeScript just because of what IntelliSense offers, but it's kind of nice to be able to kind of go in and see what the different types are and for each different option and what that's supposed to look like. And it just makes it a little bit cleaner, I think, and easier to understand. And now you have everything as TypeScript. So ultimately, it doesn't really change the processing for it. Just makes it so you can have a typed Webpack config, and that's pretty much it. So nothing changes with the compiling processes either. So it's still going to run the processing of the JavaScript and TypeScript into JavaScript just like it would have before. Hopefully you think this was a pretty intuitive and easy way to add TypeScript to your project. This isn't the only way to do it with Webpack. There are different loaders you can use out there, but I just chose one of the more common ones that I think is pretty easy to go over. So let me know what you think in the comment section below. If it was easy or hard, or if it took a long time to understand, then let me know about it in the comment section below. In the next video, as I said, we'll talk about adding TypeScript to your Parcel.js project, which will actually be probably quite a bit faster than this one because Parcel.js is a little bit quicker with some of this. So hopefully the next video will be even quicker than this one.